The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long, golden beams across the carpeted floor. It was one of those rare, quiet days when the house seemed to breathe on its own, alive only with the faint creak of settling wood and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a sea of old photographs and yellowed envelopes. I didn't know why I had started organizing the boxes. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, or the way the light made the dust motes dance in the air, reminding me of time slipping through my fingers. These pictures had been tucked away for years, hidden behind the attic door, like the parts of my life I didn't know how to revisit. I picked up a photograph, the edges slightly curled from age. It was a picture of my late husband, James, leaning against the old oak tree in the backyard. His broad smile was as familiar as the smell of his cologne, and seeing it again felt like a fist tightening around my chest. He had been gone for 3 years now, but there were still days when the grief felt fresh, raw, like an open wound that refused to heal. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced up to see Gavin, his long frame filling the doorway. He looked different from when he first arrived. Less guarded, though there was still a quiet weight in his eyes that hadn't fully lifted. "Hey," he said, his voice easy but warm. "What are you up to down here?" I held up a handful of photographs. "Just going through some old memories. Thought it was time to make sense of this mess." He stepped into the room, his gaze drifting over the piles of pictures and papers spread around me. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you," he said with a faint smile. "Tell me about it," I replied, returning his smile before turning back to the photo in my hand. Gavin hesitated, lingering in the doorway for a moment before stepping closer. "Mind if I join you?" The question caught me off guard, though I wasn't sure why. He had been nothing but kind and considerate since he moved in a few weeks ago, always offering to help with chores or fix something around the house. Still, there was something about the way he asked, the way his voice softened, that made my heart skip. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the empty space beside me. He sat down cross-legged, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of him beside me. He reached for a nearby photo, holding it up to the light. "Is this you?" he asked, grinning as he studied the image. I glanced over and couldn't help but laugh. It was an old picture of me from years ago, standing in front of a snow-covered cabin, bundled up in an oversized coat. My cheeks were flushed from the cold, my hair tucked under a knitted hat. "It is," I said, shaking my head. "I'd almost forgotten about that trip." "You look happy," Gavin said softly, his grin fading into something more thoughtful. I felt a pang in my chest at his words. "I was," I said quietly. "That was a good time in my life." We fell into a comfortable rhythm after that, passing photographs back and forth, sharing stories and laughter as we unearthed moments from the past. Gavin seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my life with James, about the family gatherings, the trips, the little inside jokes captured in each picture. But as the evening wore on, the laughter faded into something quieter, more reflective. Gavin picked up a photo of himself as a young boy, standing beside James, his arms crossed in a way that seemed far too serious for a child his age. "I remember this day," he said softly. "He was teaching me how to ride a bike. I kept falling, and I got so frustrated I didn't want to try anymore." I glanced at the photo, my heart tightening. "He was patient with you," I said. "He always said you had a stubborn streak, but he admired that about you." Gavin smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the picture. "He always made me feel like I could do anything," he said, his voice tinged with quiet sadness. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could fully ease the loss we both carried, the absence that had left a void neither of us knew how to fill. As the light outside began to fade, I realized how close Gavin had moved. His knee brushed against mine as he leaned over to place the photograph back on the pile, and the faint contact sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I shifted slightly, my heart beating faster than it should have. "We should probably call it a night," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but instead, he nodded and pushed himself to his feet. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "Probably." He lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting mine, before turning and walking toward the stairs. As I sat there in the quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a life I wasn't sure how to move forward from, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his presence filled the room, the way his voice lingered in my mind long after he was gone. Something was shifting, and it scared me. The next morning was one of those lazy Saturdays, where the hours seemed to stretch endlessly. I busied myself with small tasks around the house, folding laundry, dusting shelves, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before. The way Gavin had looked at me when he held that photograph, the quiet sadness in his voice as he spoke about James. And then later, the way his knee had brushed against mine. The warmth of him so close. It was nothing, I told myself, just a fleeting moment, a product of two people navigating the loneliness of loss. But that didn't explain the way it lingered, or the way my chest tightened every time I thought about it. I was wiping down the kitchen counters when Gavin's voice startled me. "Hey," he said, stepping into the room. I glanced up, my heart skipping as I took him in. He was dressed casually in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Morning," he replied, leaning against the doorway. "Do you need any help with breakfast?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the offer. "I was just about to make something simple," I said. "You don't have to." "I don't mind," he interrupted, his smile easy. "I've been living here for weeks now. I should probably contribute something other than my mess." I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. "All right," I said, nodding toward the fridge. "Let's see what we can come up with." We worked side by side, the small kitchen feeling even smaller with the two of us moving around each other. Gavin reached for the eggs while I chopped vegetables, our movements occasionally overlapping, a brush of shoulders here, a fleeting touch there. Each contact sent a spark through me, a quiet hum of awareness that I tried desperately to ignore. "So," Gavin said, breaking the silence as he cracked an egg into the bowl. "What's the plan for today?" "Nothing exciting," I said, focusing on the cutting board. "Just some cleaning, maybe a little gardening." "You've been doing a lot of that lately," he said, glancing at me. "It keeps me busy," I replied, shrugging. Gavin tilted his head, his gaze lingering on me. "You don't always have to stay busy, you know. It's okay to take a break." His words were simple, but they hit harder than I expected. "I know," I said softly, though the truth was, I didn't know how. As we cooked, the conversation turned lighter. Gavin told me stories about his college years, the friends he'd made, the embarrassing moments he still laughed about. His laughter was infectious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. When the omelets were done, we sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in through the window. "This is good," Gavin said, taking a bite. "You're a better cook than you give yourself credit for." "I had a good teacher," I replied, smiling faintly. "James loved to cook." Gavin's expression softened, and he set his fork down. "He did," he said quietly. "He always made it look so easy." "He had a way of doing that," I said, my chest tightening. For a moment, the air between us grew heavy, the weight of shared grief settling over us. But then Gavin smiled, small and genuine. "I think he'd be happy to see us here," he said softly. I looked at him, my throat tightening. "I hope so." After breakfast, we lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes and tidying up. The quiet rhythm of it, the clinking of plates, the sound of water running felt oddly comforting. At one point, Gavin reached over to grab a towel just as I moved to pick up a plate, and our hands brushed. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft. But he didn't pull away immediately. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. The quiet hum of the house, the sunlight filtering through the window, it all faded, leaving only the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand lingering against mine. "I'm glad I'm here," he said finally, his voice low. The words caught me off guard, and I felt my chest tighten. "I'm glad you're here too," I said softly. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, until I finally stepped back, breaking the connection. "I should finish cleaning up," I said quickly, turning away. "Yeah," Gavin said, his voice quieter now. I could feel his gaze on me as I busied myself with the dishes, my heart pounding in my chest. Later, when the kitchen was spotless and Gavin had retreated to the living room, I sat at the table, staring at the empty plate in front of me. Something was shifting between us, something I didn't know how to name. And it scared me. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the rolling hills beyond the house. The air was cool, with the faintest breeze tugging at the edges of the trees. I had been sitting by the window, watching the sunlight flicker across the leaves, when Gavin appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said, his voice light but insistent. "Where?" I asked, glancing up from the book I hadn't really been reading. "You'll see," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I hesitated, caught off guard by his sudden invitation. But there was something in his expression, a quiet determination, a kind of hope, that made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said, setting the book aside. We walked in comfortable silence, the gravel path crunching softly beneath our feet. The lake wasn't far, just a short stroll through the woods behind the house, but the journey felt like stepping into another world. The trees arched overhead, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. Birds called to each other in the distance, their melodies blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Do you remember the last time we came out here?" Gavin asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "It's been years," I admitted. "I think it was for James's birthday." Gavin nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, he wanted to fish, but we ended up just sitting by the water, talking about everything and nothing." A small smile tugged at my lips. He had a way of making the simplest moments feel special. "He did," Gavin said softly, his voice tinged with nostalgia. When we reached the lake, the sight took my breath away. The water was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the vibrant colors of the trees and the sky above. The air smelled of earth and damp leaves, the kind of scent that made you feel grounded, connected to something bigger than yourself. Gavin walked ahead, his hands tucked into his pockets, and stopped near the edge of the water. I followed, my steps slow and deliberate, as though I didn't want to disturb the fragile tranquility of the moment. "This was his favorite spot," Gavin said, his voice quiet. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the water. "He loved it here," I said softly. We stood there for a while, the silence between us filled with the soft lapping of the water against the shore. "Can I ask you something?" Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Of course," I replied, glancing at him. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the water. The question caught me off guard, but the vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin turned to look at me, his expression earnest. "How do you deal with it?" I let out a soft, shaky laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know that I do," I said honestly. "I keep busy. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions." Gavin nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's how I've been feeling too," he said. "Like I'm just existing, not living." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You're young," I said softly. "You have time to figure it out." "So do you," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice, left me breathless. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the water as I tried to steady myself. We sat down on the edge of the lake, the cool grass pressing against my palms as I leaned back. Gavin stretched out beside me, his head tilted toward the sky. "I miss him," he said after a while, his voice barely audible. "So do I," said, my throat tightening. "But being here with you," Gavin continued, his gaze shifting to me, "it doesn't feel so heavy. It feels okay." His words settled over me, warm and soothing, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that wasn't entirely painful. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. Gavin smiled then, small but genuine, and for a moment, the weight of everything else seemed to fade away. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of gold and orange, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. We walked back to the house as the first stars began to appear in the sky, the silence between us no longer heavy but comfortable, like an unspoken understanding. When we reached the porch, Gavin paused, his hand resting on the railing. "Thank you," he said softly, his gaze meeting mine. "For what?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "For coming with me," he replied. "For everything." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. As I watched him disappear into the house, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. The rain started just after dinner, a gentle patter against the windows that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and the lights flickered once or twice before settling into an uneasy glow. I had always loved storms, the way they wrapped the world in a cocoon of sound and made the indoors feel impossibly warm and safe. Tonight, though, the storm felt different. The house seemed quieter than usual, the spaces between the thunder stretches of silence that felt almost alive. I was sitting by the fireplace, a blanket draped over my legs, and a glass of wine in my hand. The flames crackled softly, their glow casting flickering shadows across the room. I had been trying to read, but the words blurred together, my thoughts too restless to focus. When Gavin walked in, I wasn't surprised. Somehow, I had known he would come. He carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, his smile easy but hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to tell him to leave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the armchair across from mine. "Of course not," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Gavin poured himself a glass, then settled into the chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the angles of his jaw, the warmth in his eyes. For a while, we didn't speak. The storm outside filled the silence, the rain a steady rhythm against the roof. "You always liked storms," Gavin said suddenly, his voice breaking through the quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "How did you know that?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Dad used to tell me, he said you loved sitting by the fire during storms, that it made you feel, what did he call it? Centered." A lump rose in my throat at the mention of James, and I looked away, my gaze fixed on the flames. "He was right," I said softly. We lapsed into silence again, the weight of the past settling between us like a third presence in the room. "Do you ever think about him?" Gavin asked, his voice quiet. "All the time," I admitted, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "He was such a big part of my life. It's hard to imagine a day when he doesn't cross my mind." Gavin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think about him too, about what he'd say if he were here." "What do you think he'd say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gavin hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I think he'd tell us to stop being so hard on ourselves," he said finally. "To stop holding on to the past so tightly that we forget how to live in the present." His words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. "He always did have a way of saying the right thing," I said, my voice trembling. Gavin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. "He wouldn't want you to feel like this," he said softly. "Like you're stuck." The honesty in his voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it was too much, too raw. I looked away, my throat tightening. "I don't know how to move on," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to let myself feel anything." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Gavin said gently. "But you deserve to feel something, Margot. You deserve to be happy." The way he said my name, soft, deliberate, sent a shiver through me. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made my chest tighten. "Gavin," I began, but the words faltered on my lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just let yourself be here. Right now." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a quiet hum that lingered long after he pulled away. The storm outside grew louder, the thunder rolling closer, but inside, the world felt impossibly still. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but unassuming, as though he was waiting for me to make the next move. I set my glass down on the table, my hands trembling slightly. "You're right," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I don't want to feel stuck anymore." Gavin's expression softened, and he leaned forward again, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness in his voice, it was enough to unravel the last thread of resistance I had been clinging to. I didn't know what I was doing, or what this meant, or where it would lead. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't drowning. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The rain hammered against the windows, thunder rumbling so deeply that it seemed to shake the floor beneath us. Yet the world inside felt unbearably still, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. Gavin's hand was still resting over mine, warm and steady. I didn't pull away, though every voice in my head screamed that I should. Instead, I stayed there, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on my chest. "You're trembling," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my fingers. "It's the storm," I whispered, though we both knew it wasn't true. Gavin leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "It's okay to be scared, Margot." My breath caught at the way he said my name, the way it fell from his lips like a quiet promise. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "Just be here, right now." His words wrapped around me, warm and grounding, and I felt something inside me begin to unravel. Before I could stop myself, I looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw a vulnerability in his expression that mirrored my own. "Gavin?" I began, but the words faltered as he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning for far too long. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the heat of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we broke apart, my breath was shaky, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" Gavin asked, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Because it's wrong," I whispered. "Because you're—" "Don't," he interrupted gently, his hand cupping my face. "Don't push me away because of what you think this is supposed to be." Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head. "I'm scared," I admitted. "So am I," he said softly. "But I'm not scared of this. I'm not scared of how I feel about you." His words broke something in me, and before I could think better of it, I kissed him again. This time with a desperation that startled even me. The room seemed to fade away, the storm outside a distant hum, as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were gentle yet firm, tracing a path down my back that left me breathless. I let myself feel every touch, every kiss, every whispered word, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel numb. We sank to the rug in front of the fire, the heat of the flames mingling with the heat between us. Gavin's touch was reverent, as though he were memorizing every inch of me, and I felt my walls crumble under the weight of it. "Margot," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here," I whispered, my hands threading through his hair. "I'm here." The night unfolded in a series of moments that blurred together. His lips on my neck, the way his hands trembled slightly as they roamed my body, the soft gasps that escaped my lips despite myself. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a lifeline, pulling me back to a place I thought I'd lost forever. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the rug, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as my own began to slow. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a fragile thread we were both afraid to break. "Are you okay?" Gavin asked finally, his voice low and tentative. I nodded, my fingers tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "Neither do I," he said softly, "but I know it felt right." His words were simple, but they carried a quiet conviction that steadied me. I tilted my head to look up at him, my gaze searching his. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Not for a second," he said, his eyes locked on mine. His honesty was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my fear and doubt. I rested my head against his chest again, letting the steady rise and fall of his breathing lull me into a fragile sense of peace. The fire had burned down to embers by the time we finally moved, and when we did, it was with a quiet understanding. Gavin helped me to my feet, his touch steady and grounding, and we stood there for a moment, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. "Good night, Margot," he said softly, his hand lingering on mine. "Good night, Gavin," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt a mix of emotions too tangled to name. But one thing was certain: something had changed between us, and there was no going back. The morning sunlight crept through the windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor. I woke slowly, the weight of the previous night pressing gently against my chest. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot everything. Forgot the storm, forgot the intensity of Gavin's gaze, forgot the way my name had sounded on his lips. But as reality settled in, so did the flood of emotions. Regret, fear, exhilaration. They all tangled together in a knot that tightened with every breath. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me as if it could shield me from the thoughts swirling in my head. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of birds chirping outside. I wondered if Gavin was awake, if he was downstairs waiting, if he felt as unmoored as I did. I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. I lingered longer than usual, brushing my hair, straightening the quilt on my bed, finding excuses to delay what felt inevitable. But eventually, I made my way downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The smell of coffee greeted me before I saw him. Gavin was in the kitchen, his back to me as he poured a steaming mug. He was dressed casually, the light gray t-shirt he wore clinging slightly to his shoulders. When he turned and saw me standing there, his expression softened. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He held out the mug. "Coffee?" I nodded, taking the cup from him, my fingers brushing his briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, a reminder of everything we hadn't said yet. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence between us heavier than usual. Gavin sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the window, while I stared at the steam rising from my cup, trying to find the right words. "About last night," I began, my voice trembling. Gavin set his mug down, his attention snapping to me. "Margot, if you regret it—" "I don't," I said quickly, cutting him off. "I don't regret it." His shoulders relaxed slightly and the tension in his jaw eased. "Then what?" he asked softly. I let out a shaky breath, my hands tightening around the mug. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "I don't know where we go from here." "We don't have to figure it all out right now," Gavin said gently. "We can take it one step at a time." His words were simple, but they steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw nothing but patience and understanding in his expression. "Okay," I said softly, my voice barely audible. The day passed slowly, the weight of the conversation lingering between us but not suffocating. Gavin didn't push me to talk more, didn't try to define what had happened. Instead, he was simply there, his presence steady and reassuring. In the late afternoon, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, the sun casting a soft glow over the newly planted flowers. I crouched by one of the beds, pulling a few stray weeds, while Gavin worked beside me. "This looks better than I expected," he said, glancing around the yard. "You don't give yourself enough credit," I replied, smiling faintly. He chuckled, the sound low and easy. "I couldn't have done it without you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I looked at him, my gaze lingering on the curve of his smile, the warmth in his eyes. "Gavin," I began, my voice faltering. He looked up, his expression soft but intent. "Yeah?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "Thank you," I said finally, "for being here, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said softly, his voice steady. "I do," I insisted, my voice trembling, "because I don't know where I'd be if you weren't." His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment the world seemed to still. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice low but firm. I nodded, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. "I know." That evening, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange. The air was cool, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "Do you think it'll ever stop feeling complicated?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know," I admitted, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it just is." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I can live with that." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the day settling over us like a blanket. But it wasn't a heavy weight. It was the kind that grounded you, that reminded you of where you were and where you wanted to be. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I turned to Gavin, my heart pounding. "I don't know what the future looks like," I said softly, "but I know I want to face it with you." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his touch steady and warm. "One step at a time," he said, his voice a quiet promise. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. One step at a time. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking alone.